How does an author use language to create a dramatic shift in tone and to show changes in a character's perspective? In this lesson, you will learn to identify dynamic changes in character and tone by analyzing an author's use of figurative language. Let's review. This is a non-fiction narrative. It is also informative because it is based on the life of the author Frederick Douglass. Douglass was born into slavery in the 1800s, and he has learned to read. In the process, he has encountered some new ideas. He now knows that slavery is not a natural state. He perceives slave owners as thieves who have stolen the slaves from their homes and bound them in servitude. In step 1, we will reread the text to find words and phrases which reveal a character's thoughts and feelings. Step 2, ask yourself, what does the author's use of language reveal about the character, and how does it affect the tone of the passage? Step 3, what conclusions can be drawn about the author's use of language? Jot down your conclusions. Starting with step 1, reread the text to find words and phrases which reveal a character's thoughts and feelings. I notice that the author starts out talking about learning to read. He writes, learning to read had been a curse rather than a blessing. It had given him a view of a wretched condition without the remedy. It caused him to see his life as a horrible pit, but to no ladder of escape. He envies his fellow slaves for their stupidity. It says he wished himself a beast, even thinking it would be better to be a reptile. He talks about everlasting thinking of his condition that torments him. He says there's no getting rid of it. It was pressed upon him by every object within sight or hearing, animate or inanimate, which means living or not living. In step 2, ask yourself, what does the author's use of language reveal about the character, and how does it affect the tone of the passage? I realize right away that the author is using figurative language when he says that learning to read had been a curse. He creates a metaphor by equating learning to read as being equal to a curse. When I read, it had given, I know that the word it refers back to learning to read. So he continues to talk about reading when he says, it had given me a view of my wretched condition without the remedy. Here is figurative language again. The author makes learning to read sound like an animate being when he says it gives him something, in this case, a view of his condition as a slave. The author's language here paints a very dark and somber picture. It sounds like Frederick has been diagnosed with some horrible disease for which there is no cure. The part about his eyes being open to a horrible pit, but to no ladder of escape, paints a strong image of him being thrown into some kind of bottomless hole and left there helpless and alone. Equating his life to a wretched condition and a horrible pit are further examples of figurative language. These implied metaphors leave me thinking that Frederick perceives his existence as complete and total misery. This really affects the tone of the passage, turning it into something that is dark and terrible. As I read on, I see that Frederick envies his fellow slaves for their stupidity. I believe he is talking about the fact that fellow slaves don't really understand slavery as a form of oppression. Frederick understands that because he's learned to read and he's read about it. Then he continues with these really strong statements. He wishes he were a beast. He says that he would prefer to be a lowly reptile than to be himself. He talks about this everlasting thinking and how it torments him. So Frederick is thinking three things. I wish I didn't understand what being a slave really means. Even a snake is better off than me. and thinking about being a slave is torment. Now, it is certainly extreme to wish yourself to be a beast. Even more so to think that a snake has a better life than you do. And how awful to be tormented by thinking that your life is in such a terrible state. This just seems to be getting worse and worse for Frederick. Here the author is using hyperbole or extreme exaggeration as a tool to drive home how desperate and defeated Frederick is feeling. The author's choice of words and figurative language is quite effective in creating a negative shift in the tone of the passage. The picture Frederick paints of his own life reveals a world of dark, inner turmoil and defeat. Now, step 3. What conclusions can be drawn about the author's use of language? Jot down your conclusions. Great writing does not happen by accident. I feel confident in drawing 2 conclusions about how Frederick crafted this passage. First, I feel that he was very purposeful in selecting and using various figurative language techniques to achieve his purpose as an author. Second, by using figurative language, metaphors, hyperbole, and personification, Douglas was able to create a dramatic shift in tone and show dynamic changes in a character's personal perspective. These are the steps that we used in our lesson today. We reread the text to find words and phrases which revealed a character's thoughts and feelings. We ask ourselves, what does the author's use of language reveal about the character, and how does it affect the tone of the passage? Then we ask, what conclusions can be drawn about the author's use of language, and we jotted down our conclusions. In this lesson, you have learned how to identify dynamic changes in character and tone by analyzing an author's use of figurative language.